having pressed the pause button in March, everything kind of came grinding to a halt. Everybody was either sent home from studios and offices or from film shoots on the streets of LA or around the country or on sets. Some are continuing in post-production where they're able to work remotely. But, the big question is like sort of how this all starts up again.
The immediate effects of the coronavirus have taken a toll on daily business for movie theaters, but COVID-19 affects far more than exhibition. Production has paused virtually everywhere, and for movies that were already shot, the post-production pipeline has been derailed. This week, we speak to Los Angeles Times reporter Anousha Sakoui to learn how the shutdown will affect the movie business for the foreseeable future. This is the Boxoffice Podcast. I'm Russ Fischer, editorial director of the Boxoffice Studios, which provides editorial content for movie theaters. And I'm joined, as always, by my excellent co-host, Daniel Loria, who's editorial director of Boxoffice Pro. Hey, Daniel.
Hey, Russ. How's your week been going?
Honestly, this one's pretty good. I think it's good. Yeah. We'll go with good. How are you?
Always good. New York is getting in that wonderful sweet spot of not oppressively hot and humid and not freezing cold. So, it's been a nice sort of couple of weeks where you get to open the windows and enjoy the outside.
Yeah, my garden is exploding, and now I just have to resist the impulse to go to Lowe's and buy mulch and stuff all the time, which, nobody needs to be doing right now, or I certainly don't.
This week, Russ, I'm actually excited to talk about the topic that we have on the agenda, where we're going to be discussing the Hollywood production pipeline with a special guest here in the podcast, the Los Angeles Times reporter, Anousha Sakoui. She is a great colleague of ours here in the entertainment press. I've known her for a number of years, dating back to her time at Bloomberg when she first moved to the US back in 2014. A great colleague that I always love running into over at CinemaCon in Las Vegas. And obviously this year, quite disappointed that we didn't get to catch up in person, but we have her here on the show this week.
Welcome, Anousha. It's great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the big overarching question that we have here is, how has COVID-19 upended the production pipeline in Hollywood and in the world at large?
Well, yeah, that's the question that sort of and how did it restart? Having pressed the pause button in March, everything kind of came grinding to a halt. Everybody was either sent home from their studios and offices or from film shoots on the streets of LA or around the country or on sets. Some are continuing in post-production where they're able to work remotely and online. But, the big question is sort of how this all starts up again. And we're seeing various plans and task forces in every state in the US and in most countries around the world. I just reported, in the past few days with my colleague, Ryan Fonda, about, these efforts in different countries to kind of prove how safe they are. And as they kind of, seems a bit almost like a safety arms race, a bit like we saw with tax incentives, where they're trying to open up as fast as possible, but also boast not only their tax credits, but also their safety measures and how they have it all figured out. So that's been quite interesting to watch. But we're still on pause right now, and I think there's a lot of questions about how this all gets back together.
And yeah, what you bring up about those tax credits, Anousha, I think is a great point in that it's something that really has revolutionized Hollywood in recent years. Russ, I know you spent some time living in Georgia, so you were able to see firsthand the sort of difference that those tax credits have made for film production in that state.
Absolutely. And it's a huge difference because I moved to Georgia from Boston in 2002. I actually came from the production community, and there was not much of a production scene to speak of in Atlanta at the time when I moved in. And so everything that we associate with Atlanta production now, which is huge, and with Georgia production, really came up in the past 15 years or so, which means to have that all taken away very quickly is a massive and potentially devastating shift. So, Anousha, do you have any sense of the financial effect that this shutdown has had on communities around the country and around the world?
It's a really good question. It was actually something I was trying to dig out last week. I've spoken to analysts, and I mean, you see some numbers. I've seen others report numbers in the billions, but it's hard to really quantify. I think what we know is that at least, hundreds of thousands, according to IATSE, which represents about 150,000 cast and crew. That's not obviously to talk about the related industries that supply and staff sets, catering, etc. But, they've talked about hundreds of thousands losing hours of work or losing jobs. We know across the industry that, people might have been paid for a few weeks after work, but are largely out of work now and on unemployment. And around the world, we see, countries like the UK, which is, in the top 3 most times of filming in terms of volume of filming budgets, is talking about severe recession potentially. So I think it's hard to quantify the actual loss. I think Disney's put some numbers out there, over $1 billion they just talked about. So there is a talk of sort of like a permanent shift or a permanent, like medium to long-term impact in terms of the scale of companies, after furloughing tens of thousands of people at least Disney, are all of those going to be rehired? And, we're already talking about when there is a restart in filming, crews having to be smaller for safety reasons. So this by definition means, less people being employed. And I think, Georgie's a really good example to talk about because, we've spoken to Pinewood in Atlanta. Well, Pinewood Atlanta, I think it's called, now that it's recently had a change of ownership. But and also Tyler Perry Studios, who supposedly is starting filming very soon on a sort of sequestered sort of set, very quick, intense shooting times to reduce the amount of time people have to be together or separated from their families and are sort of quarantining. So it's going to be interesting to see how those play out. There's a lot of big questions about insurance, whether states open up. And they open up for California, but they open up and whether or not any production is going to want to take the risk associated with someone getting sick and legal ramifications of that, and also cost overruns. And, insurance companies are largely not covering for anything COVID related right now. So that's a big question. So I see a lot of headlines about things starting up and filming, but it's not clear to me that they are actually starting.
Building on that insurance and liability question, I know that you're very close to the different unions in Hollywood in your reporting. What have you heard from them in terms of what the protections they're looking for their members as we start looking to ramp production back up?
This is a really vital question. I mean, I think we saw with some Australian productions that were talking about having people double up on crews and doing jobs of other people. And, I think you saw SAG-AFTRA, who, represents performers, really trying to push back on, we're trying to protect the jobs of background performers, because we're talking now about having, are you going to have crowd scenes? How are you going to do them? And, and also making sure that, sure, someone wants to say, we're starting up filming, but the union's clearly putting out messaging out there that they want their members to be safe and protected. And there were reports about SAG-AFTRA, telling members that they, can deny work to come to them if they're being asked to work and they don't feel safe. So I think this is, on top of insurance, a really big issue that the unions are focused on and already working at in terms of coming up with protocols that they feel happy with and talking to the studios about that. And, a production might say, oh, yeah, we want to go ahead. But the unions, I think, are going to have quite a powerful voice in that. I mean, I think that's something that we're going to see play out quite interestingly over the coming weeks.
And there'll also be a lot of decisions to be made by individual crew members. I mean, anyone who has even seen images of a movie being shot knows that these are teams of people who work in a very close physical proximity to one another. Hair and makeup, props, those teams obviously have to touch actors. But even if you're not on those teams, people are working shoulder to shoulder because that's just the way the work has always been done. How do you project that someone who works in hair and makeup might approach their job going forward, even if IATSE says, okay, it's okay to go back to work now?
Depending on what country you're in and which union, they are all going to have thresholds of sanitation and practices they're quite detailed. I mean, I've seen, in different protocols that have come up from countries like the United Kingdom, for example, already. I mean, they're just in sort of a proposal stage. They're sort of waiting for feedback from unions. But they're very detailed about the use of dressing rooms or only single-use dressing rooms, reducing actually the number of makeup and costume changes to reduce the amount of interaction and staffing needed on set and activity generally, and interaction between actors and makeup artists or costumers. I think you can kind of get into the nitty-gritty of people have talked about lots of different things in terms of PPE for protective medical grade protective equipment for makeup artists, disposing of tools that they use, things like that. But I think again, it's going to be a question of uniformity of protocols across the board, so that, and I think that's what the unions have said that they want that wherever you are in the world, that if you're a member of a union, and this is a largely unionized industry, that you're going to have to, the productions are going to have to meet certain protocols and make sure that they can perform their job in a safe way. And then it's going to be up to actors, are they going to feel safe? I'm sure we're going to see lots of interesting stories around how this actually plays out. But in my mind, there's sort of echoes of what we've seen in some other industries which have been considered essential, where you have seen stresses from people, being called to work in factories or warehouses where they just don't feel safe. And yet, if they don't do that, they lose their job, or they worry that they'll lose their job.
Oh, and in a production, we're talking about a situation where anyone that tests positive during that production is likely going to have to be isolated. And if it comes to one of the stars or a director or a cinematographer, we're talking about at least a 2-week suspension of the production, which can be very, very costly. It's not like a baseball team or a soccer team that you just sub someone else in. It's going to be a very difficult period. And one of the aspects that you bring up, Anousha, that I think is very interesting is how different countries are going to be handling the situation very differently. Right now, are there certain countries that are already opening a little bit more or are further along in being able to restart productions? Are you seeing any studios or production companies going anywhere right now to take advantage of that?
So in our latest story, we talked to the film commissioner in New Zealand, and also the Czech Republic has been talking about productions, smaller domestic productions starting up. And those are, for example, underway already, say in New Zealand. And there are some places where that is the case, where the countries have been very Iceland. My colleague Stacey Perman has written a lot about Iceland, where Netflix has been very public about filming there, really in countries where they're smaller and they have been very successful in shutting down the virus, containing it. So, but the potential for international crews coming in. So, for example, I think it's quite interesting with the case of New Zealand. Yes, they already have small domestic productions going, but Avatar, as far as my understanding, talking to them, is not able to recruit yet because it needs international crews, and countries are still working on the whole issue of the restrictions around their borders. So that will probably be the next stage. But, the UK has talked about, in my interview with Adrian Wooten of the British Film Commission, said, they're hopeful for this summer. We'll see.
Ultimately, with all of this in mind, one of the massive questions going forward is, what sort of effect can you project, or can anyone project this all having on a release calendar going down the line? Is a movie that was in post-production now that was expected to be released in December going to be delayed? What about things that were set for 2021?
Well, I was actually just talking to someone on a film that's in post-production. I think the question of if something needs reshoots, that's obviously going to delay things a lot more than they might have otherwise. If there were, there's always usually reshoots, or largely, it's very frequently major films will have reshoots. But in this case, maybe films will go ahead without it. But post-production, a lot of it, I've been hearing some interesting stories about how that's happening sort of remotely and online using sort of virtual production techniques. So the post work, I think, is largely being done. Animation, I think, will probably have a great advantage in this period, as many of those artists have been able to continue working. And I think it's also interesting that writers have continued to work during this period, so that shows and films can be ready to be put into production very quickly and stock up. But at some point, they're going to run out of projects if filming doesn't start.
And you mentioned the writers. I know before back in the before days when there wasn't a global pandemic, there were some concerns about a potential writer strike maybe happening in 2020. If only that was the biggest problem we had to deal with this year around the world. What are the prospects of that? How is that really tuning up? Does it look like we're going to have to deal in this industry with not only a pandemic, but also a strike?
It looks unlikely at this point, but it doesn't mean that things are great between the Alliance of Motion Picture Producers, the AMPTP. He's probably not saying the full acronym fully, but the Alliance of Producers and Motion Picture Makers who negotiate with the Writers Guild and other writers and other guilds. Currently, they have been in talks with SAG-AFTRA about renewing their collective bargaining agreement, and that might come to agreement before the Writers Guild, which just started talks on Monday. There has already been some flashpoints between them. So I think before their contract expired at the beginning of May, there was expectation that given all the pain that's going on in Hollywood, it's going to be very difficult for writers to sort of go on strike, and I sort of wrote a piece to that effect. But I think it was interesting to see that I think one concern, maybe if you're a studio, is that the writers have been able to keep going and they have continued to be able to earn money, unlike other, and so we're in a strong position. They're not, in the kind of maybe more vulnerable position of other people that haven't been working. I think, we saw some flashpoints between David Young, the lead negotiator from the Writers Guild, and Carol Lombardini, who's the president of the AMPTP, sort of fighting quite publicly about the terms and the parameters of what they're going to negotiate. And it's not been, smooth already, but it's currently in negotiation. And I think there's a potential for, I'm sure the Writers Guild will be pushing, and they're still continuing to fight a very long battle they've been having with the talent agencies. So I don't think it's completely off the table, but it's a little bit, it's much more reduced than I think it would have been, obviously, without the pandemic.
I also wonder about the effect that this has on awards season, which everyone has an opinion about awards season and whether it's kind of a good or a bad thing, but it's inarguable that the awards season is a giant money machine for the industry and a giant publicity machine, which helps drive audience interest in movies and shows. Do you see or have you heard about potential long-range effects in that sector?
I mean, I think the thing that's really interesting about the awards is how the eligibility is changing and how that is impacting the whole windowing, or, the sort of the release to home video timetable that has been like a real flashpoint in Hollywood. And we've seen some, say, the Union Guild Awards talking about, and other awards talking about removing the need for a theatrical release as part of its eligibility requirements. And this is this has been quite a controversial point in the past couple of years. So I think that's going to be quite interesting to watch, to see what kind of long-term impact this has on how films are released and the power that theatrical circuits have on movies and movie releases. It seems like they might be, losing a bit of that power, and see that window of that typical 3-month exclusivity reduce. So I think that's going to be quite interesting. And then, the award season is a huge part of the industry, as some people get bored of it, but I love it. I mean, I've covered it. And my colleagues will be covering it this year. I think it's just going to be interesting to see how, are we going to have a theatre full of people come February for the Oscars? It's hard to imagine right now, but I'm sure they'll find some way of doing it.
No, and you say that in the same week that we see a title like Greyhound going to premium VOD through Apple Plus, and it's telling, as my colleague Sean Robbins, the chief analyst here at Boxoffice Pro, said, that's a title whose main demographic were men over the age of 50, which is also one of the main demographics for this coronavirus crisis that we have. So as we sort of see the titles that are going into premium VOD, from family titles like Trolls World Tour and Scoob, while there are parents at home right now wrestling with their children, basically, months on end. And you're going to see probably a lot of these older skewing titles that would go for a target demographic that honestly is probably the most sensitive during this return to theaters that we're going to be seeing in the coming months.
Right, and my colleague Ryan Saunders just did the story about this Russell Crowe film, Unhinged, which is supposedly going to be in one of the first films that gets released in July. And I've seen some sort of interesting kind of commentary online to that, like are people's is the first film that people going to really like risk their lives to see be this film? I don't know. I think there's filmmakers that I would like Christopher Nolan. I love his films. Like, yeah, I'll find a weekday and I'll go find a 70mm IMAX screen in LA. I think there's only one anyway. So, but like, and then I'll make an event of it and I'll buy 3 seats. I probably won't because that would be really expensive, but you know what I mean? That's kind of something I think like you'll see probably it's going to be super interesting to see how this plays out because yes, I'm sure people want to go to theaters and do return to normality. And we are already getting sick of quarantine, right? People already have this quarantine fatigue, and some people just don't believe it's the same risk anymore. You've seen protests of people wanting to have greater freedoms in moving around, right? But I think that it's hard to see the same level of attendance and the same consumer behavior in the short to medium term because we've become used to doing things for another way and found things more convenient. People who might not have been so into having a home entertainment system might have upgraded in this time, and if they could afford it, and then thought, actually, it's all right watching this movie at home. Whereas they might, but at the same time, people will always be faithful to the theatrical experience and not think it's any different. So. But in the same way as like I haven't probably been to a store in 6 weeks. I've been like, I've discovered, I can get my food delivered tomorrow really easily. It really it just exacerbates my laziness or my not wanting to kind of, you know what I mean? My inner introvert really flourished at this time.
No, and that Tuesday 2 p.m. screening is going to be the hot ticket once we get back up and running. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that demand is going to shift.
I'm going to have these a lot of meetings. I had to be out there seeing people, but I'll probably be at some theater at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Go tell my boss.
As someone who has always prized, the 10 a.m. Thursday screening where you can kind of go and sit in a nearly empty house.
That's too early for me.
I feel like things are going to be very different going forward.
Yeah.
All the patterns are going to have to change. Okay, so Daniel, before we go, you and I over the last couple of months have discussed some of our own viewing habits. You had proposed a question that was about what we've been watching that is essentially long form, whether it's, movie or a series, something that's over 200 minutes, because now supposedly we all have the time.
Supposedly is the key word there, right? I don't think I've ever been this busy outside of my regular sort of work habits. So yeah, I wish we had it. So the sort of rules we kind of came up with was, I think, anything 200 minutes or above, no multi-season TV shows, but limited TV series, I think is fair to say, is in the game. On my end, I'm here in a small apartment in New York City that's been hit rather strongly by this crisis. It gave me the opportunity to revisit Scenes from a Marriage, the famous multi-part television series from Ingmar Bergman. I'm here with my wife, and fortunately, I can say that our very intense close-quarter conversations are nothing like the 6-hour painful saga of this Swedish couple that we are currently revisiting.
It's a great choice. It's a great choice. Anousha, is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Well, yeah, the limited series Normal People, which I've now watched twice in this period. I'm sort of literally dehydrated afterwards because I just cry so much. I mean, I really, really highly recommend it. It's based on the book from Sally Rooney, and there's also a short story that she did. And I think we'll see Daisy Edgar Jones and Paul Mescal already, who's been, described as the most attractive man in Britain, or the United Kingdom, I should say. But that's what they called him in one interview. Just so you've got some real stars coming up from that show. Well, it's not, it's kind of a limited series, and it's inspired. I think we'll see a lot more people talking about it. It's also like a Hulu original. It's interesting. And Hulu's been kind of interesting sort of mine for content over this period, I found.
I just realized this question is like the anti-Quibi question. Is that how I even pronounce it? Quibi?
Quibi, yeah.
Quibi.
Yeah.
Quibi. Yeah, it's the
Quibi.
anti-Quibi. I feel sorry, apologies to Mr. Katzenberg for the question. Russ, how about on your end?
I think Mr. Katzenberg has bigger problems than whatever we have to say about Quibi. So actually, I have two quick answers. And the first actually is a Hulu or something that you can watch on Hulu now. And I agree that Hulu has some really terrific presentations at the moment. For me, because technically this is not a multi-season show, it is the fact that Hulu is now streaming Terriers, which is the one season sort of almost Paul Thomas Anderson-esque detectives get into a weird sort of scenario thing, starring Donald Logue by Sean Ryan, who had made The Shield. It's a magnificent show that kind of hit just at the beginning of, what we call prestige TV now. And I think if that show had debuted in 2013, there'd probably be 6 or 8 seasons of it. Instead, it debuted in 2010, I think. And it was one of the first shows on FX, and nobody knew what it was. It didn't do very well. It was canceled after 1 season, but it's on Hulu now, and it's wonderful.
I'm gonna look that one up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was hoping Terriers would be like 200 minutes of dogs. Well, that would also be awesome.
Well, and then my other answer is on the Criterion channel. I think they're streaming it still, which is the long cut of Until the End of the World by Wim Wenders, which is a 4.5 hour kind of post-apocalypse romance. So it's very appropriate for right now, but it's gorgeous. It's got a wonderful soundtrack. It's got William Hurt in a terrific performance. It's a thing that was sort of rumored to exist for a long time, and then we knew it existed, and it was difficult to find, and now you can see it, and it's grand. It's wonderful.
Well, Anousha, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been an enjoyable discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Anousha. This has been great. And Daniel, great to talk to you again. I'm glad that we could finally dig into this particular aspect of the whole coronavirus crisis. And thank you to everyone for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our show and rate us. You can find the Box Office Podcast on pretty much any podcast service of your choice. The Box Office Podcast is produced by Caitlin Kehoe and Bradley Denham, and written and narrated by Daniel Loria and me, Russ Fischer. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.